Hello and welcome back to HEMAFightBreakdowns. Today I'm going to be talking about judging. And I usually don't talk about judging because it's not something that I usually want to call attention to because, well, sometimes a lot of HEMA judges are wrong and sometimes I'm wrong. And talking about whether or not someone is wrong and how they explain an exchange isn't always very helpful. But what is very helpful is explaining how you can get better at judging. Now, the first and most obvious way is that you just watch more fights. But there's another way that I think a lot of people don't necessarily know about, and that is to use Olympic fencing's right-of-way rule set to judge. Now, a lot of people understandably don't like right-of-way rule sets, and they sometimes don't like anything related to Olympic fencing. But I promise you that this is a really, really good idea, because despite the fact that you might not use a right-of-way rule set, explaining an exchange using the rules of right-of-way is absolutely perfect for getting better at judging, because the rules of right-of-way break down every single exchange into little bits and parts that you can fully understand, and it uses those parts to explain what happened and who gets what point and why. And regardless of whether or not you're using that rule set, being able to break down an exchange into its subsequent pieces and then explain what happened and what the intent of each fencer was during the exchange is essential to being able to properly judge an actual HEMA bout. So I'm going to show some sparring footage again from some friends of mine, and I'm going to use the right-of-way rule set to break down each exchange, not just to assign points or anything arbitrary like that, but because you want to be able to understand how these exchanges really flow so that you can better understand them and better judge them for yourself. So, starting off with something a little bit simple, we have an exchange where fighter on the right throws an attack and just lands it. And one of the key aspects of this is that in right-of-way rule sets, attacks are always given priority. And a lot of people don't necessarily know what that means, but when it comes to the era of judging, the important thing that giving an attack priority as the beginning of the exchange is that it really tells you when things started. Most people, when they're fencing, will just kind of go back and forth, dance in and out of range, test each other out, and putting that into your explanation of what happened is of course, useless. So it makes a whole lot of sense to start any explanation and any breakdown of an exchange with the attack. So if you were judging this from an Olympic fencing perspective, you'd gesture to the fencer on the right and say, attack yes, because their attack was the initiating action of the exchange, and it landed, aka saying yes. And the idea here is that by saying attack yes in a right-of-way rule set, you're saying this person is going to get a point because, again, attacks always get priority. But even if you're judging a rule set like Nordic, where attacks don't always get priority, the fact that all I say is attack yes means that the attack is the only thing that landed, and it's the only thing that happened, and thus it's the only thing that scored. Regardless of what happens in what rule set or what kind of judging you happen to be doing, understanding that the start of every exchange is the attack, and to simply start off your explanation of saying the attack that initiated the exchange landed can just be the end of your explanation. It's actually a really short and efficient way to talk about things, because despite the fact that you're leaving out the fact that someone failed a parry, bringing attention to that is just sort of implied by the fact that the attack landed. You always want to assume that somebody had an intent to defend themselves, but it's not worth mentioning if it doesn't work. So with another simple one to look at, we have an exchange where fighter on the right initiates the attack, fighter on the left parries and reposts that attack and lands. Now, in Olympic fencing terminology, this would be attack no, parry, riposte yes. But the reason it's broken down that way, and the reason that way to break it down is so efficient, is because it only A, mentions the parry if it is successful in the repost afterwards, because at the end of the day, the only thing that matters is somebody who scores points. Parrying doesn't score points, so unless there is a repost that comes after that parry, it's not worth talking about. Now, if we imagine a scenario where fighter on the right threw an attack, fighter on the left got that parry, but then also missed their follow-up attack, well then, you wouldn't mention either of that. You'd watch the two fighters reset, maybe create a little distance, and then start a whole new part of their exchange, in which case someone else's attack would become the new attack. The reason this is so good for encapsulating what happens in an exchange in your mind is because you have to make sure that everything that you're talking about when you're judging an exchange is a lead up to what scores. Everything else must be discarded. And as you probably know, if you've ever judged before, one of the biggest problems with judging is trying to keep too many things in your mind at once and trying to judge all of them. You never should have to judge a parry on whether or not it is effective. You should only be able to judge an attack or an attack, or it's maybe a parry repost or a counterattack. So in this particular exchange, again, you got the parry repost on the left. It lands. It's the only thing that matters aside from the fact that the exchange started with the attack on the right. Next up, we have one that's, well, at least simple in the world of Olympic fencing, but not so simple in the world of HEMA, and sometimes one that can confuse a lot of people when it comes to judging. We have an attack on the right here. We have a little bit of blade contact, and then we have an attack from the left that lands while the attack on the right does not. Now, in Olympic fencing, you're going to say attack right, no, counterattack left, yes. And the reason this is a counterattack and not a parry riposte is because at the end of the day, the blade contact that happened had absolutely nothing to do with whether or not either of the attacks landed or would be discounted in the rules of right of way. Now, you might be thinking, okay, well, that doesn't matter in something like a Nordic rule set, but it actually really does. The thing here about this stripped down understanding of the exchange is that you have to discard everything that doesn't matter, and the reality here is that this blade contact just simply does not matter. The reason the attack on the left landed is because they maintained their distance, walked backwards, and sniped their opponent in the hands, but holding all of that information in your head can be really, really tough. What you have to make sure of is A, did the attack on the right land? No. Did the attack on the left land? Yes. Was it an attack that initiated the action? No, it was an attack that happened after the initiated action, meaning it is a counterattack. And that's all you need to think about. All you need to care about is why the exchange happened and why it would be judged a certain way based on the rule set. And while something like a Nordic rule set would be very, very simple, only one person landed anything, knowing who attacked and knowing whether or not they landed is still an essential thing that you need to have in your head when you're judging. Coming up next is an exchange that would actually be really, really tough and complicated in Olympic fencing, but is much easier for us in the HEMA world, and that is an exchange where both people just attack each other. Now, in Olympic fencing, the absolute most important thing that you would have to figure out here is who attacked first, and you'd have to pretty much get a slow-mo replay to try to figure that out. In my opinion, it was fighter on the left who really is initiating the action, who's really doing the attack, but at the end of the day, if you're doing something like a Nordic rule set, it just doesn't matter. All that matters is whether or not these attacks landed. Now, in my opinion, both of them kind of just missed. But the real important factor here is that just because you are judging an Olympic fencing right of rule style in order to kind of like encapsulate things in your brain doesn't mean you have to care about this one pitfall of Olympic fencing right of way fencing, which is that you have to know who attacks. It's pretty easy to just say double in the world of HEMA and just kind of be done with who attacks and who initiates. This way, you don't have to get so far into the nitty-gritty of looking at individual frames of who moves their feet, or also defining what starts as a preparation, namely whether or not counts your hands going forward or just your feet going forward. You don't have to care about any of that. All you have to care about is they both attacked, they both landed, or they both didn't land, and that's the end of the exchange. Next up, we have an exchange that could be considered really complicated if you wanted to try to describe everything that happened, but can actually be very easily simplified with a right-of-way kind of dissertation. Now, what happens here is fighter on the right initiates their thrust. They duck under their opponent's parries once, maybe even arguably twice, before landing their thrust, at which point, after failing one or two parries, fighter on the left just throws a thrust of their own and lands it. So what do you call this? And the irony here is that some people will try to describe every single one of the ducks and every single one of the parries as either failed or successful, but the irony is that all you have to call this is attack right, yes, counterattack left, yes. And that's all you need to care about, because at the end of the day, all these failed parries, all of these lacks of blade contact, all of these ducks don't really change how the fight started, and it doesn't change who ended up scoring points. If this was Olympic fencing, obviously, fighter on the right would have gotten their point for being able to successfully land their attack, but if you're judging every single attack is equal, simply they hit each other. It doesn't really matter that the fencer on the right was moving forward or fencer on the left was moving backwards. It doesn't matter that fencer on the left failed to parry once or maybe twice. All that matters is what happened at the very end, and that is they both threw an attack that landed, and we're just giving information to the fighter on the right as being the initiator with attack yes, in case that matters. Now, the final little puzzle piece to this is that it's not just important to be thinking about these kinds of things when you're thinking about judging, but also when you're doing your own fencing. A lot of times people will say that, well, I'm not a good judge because I've never really had a chance to try it. And they're probably not wrong. Many people just don't get an opportunity to be a judge at a tournament. And when they do, it's often one of the first couple times they've done it and they get really nervous and they make a lot of bad calls and they feel so bad about their experience that they just never want to do it again. But a really simple and easy way that you can get your judging experience in using this kind of understanding of how to break down an exchange is when you're watching other people free spar. There is no rules against watching somebody else free spar and judging their match like it was a tournament. Use a particular rule set that you know might be coming up. Use the one that your club uses all the time in its own little, inner club sparring matches. Use any rule set you feel like, even right of way, as long as it means that you are putting in your own time trying to judge an exchange. And just getting those reps in of breaking down an exchange into what happened, who landed, who didn't, and why they landed their attack, counterattack, or parry repost is going to get you into the rhythm of judging exchanges, judging them accurately, and just getting understanding of the kinds of situations that come up naturally. When you're judging a particular kind of rule set, you're suddenly going to see the kinds of caveats and weird situations that come up all the time that make that system hard to judge. When you're fencing right of way, you're going to watch two people who look like they just attack simultaneously. And you're going to get a good firsthand experience of what that looks like and what that feels like to try to judge. Similarly, in something like Nordic, you're going to get a good example of what someone looks like when they just pull off of a parry and throw a revenge after blow to the middle maybe. And you're going to get an understanding of, oh, I know that that's what they're trying to do. They're getting their points in this particular rule set because I broke down the exchange the way that I'm breaking it down right now. I have an understanding of what is going into the intent of each of these fencers. It's going to give you the best possible tool set for understanding and actually getting better at judging without, again, having to go to a tournament and sign up to be a judge. So the next time you're at a tournament and someone is just panicking because they don't have a judge and they point to you in the crowd and say, sorry, bud, it's your time, you're going to have all the experience you need to go up there and confidently say what you think you saw. And at the end of the day, if you're only 60, 70, 80% right, you're going to be one of the best judges in HEMA. So get those reps in. Take this example, take this kind of framework and take it to your own club and get better at judging, because in my opinion, doing it like this is really the only way to get better. But if that is going to be it for today, if you want to see more videos, I'm going to have a new one on Thursday. Not sure what it's going to be about yet because, of course, Helsinki has not happened yet. But I will see you then regardless.